Mr. Stephen Mosher is the director of the Asian Studies Center at Claremont Institute in Southern California. Mr. Mosher was the first and last Westerner to carry out a full-length study of a Chinese village and commune since the Communist Revolution. He was involved with his pursuit of his doctorate from Stanford University. Perhaps many of you heard about this controversy. The Chinese government put pressure on Stanford, and Stanford kicked him out of the doctorate program because they wanted to keep an open door policy with China. So I hope Mr. Mosher will comment a little bit on that experience. After he has published his findings and photographs of the officially sanctioned infanticide and abortion in that country. He's published two books at this point. One is on your table. He is working on a third one. I think you'll be interested to hear the details of his most recent trip. He went over there just a couple of months ago after extensive efforts, unbeknownst to the Chinese government, and was able to even visit the village that he had attended in earlier years. Just recently, he attended a conference at the White House and had the honor of being introduced as the person that had contributed the most to the understanding of the forced abortion, the infanticide, and the forced IUD insertion that was taking place in Red China. Next weekend, he will have an article. I understand this was quite a task to get this in the Washington Post, but there will be an article in the Washington Post on his findings. And you may find also on your desk a summary of an article that was published in Reader's Digest. This was the most, in that particular issue, this was some time ago, in that particular issue, this had the most readers' interest of any of the articles that was in there. And the January 1988 issue of Reader's Digest will have an update based on his current trip of the situation discussed in the earlier article. Would you all join with me in welcome Mr. Stephen Mosher?
I'd like to thank Tom for that very kind introduction. I should begin my talk today with a disclaimer of a sort. You should all know that everything you hear today, you're hearing from someone who has been declared by the Ministry of State Security in the People's Republic of China to be an international spy. So if you've ever wondered what an international spy looks like, or what you have to do to become one, you'll find out today. I went to China for the first time in 1979. That was the infamous year that we broke off diplomatic relations with our longtime friends on the Republic of China and established on January 1st, 1979, diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. Former president was hoping, I understand, that would change the outcome of the election later the next year, but it didn't, fortunately. Of the 50 Americans who were selected in the first wave of scholars to go to China, there was only one, myself, who wanted to go into a Chinese village. And there was only one research proposal which Peking turned down. And that, namely, was my proposal. They didn't want, clearly, any foreign social scientist wandering around in the countryside finding out the truth about the Communist Revolution. It was only after that former president brought up the matter of my research in a meeting with Deng Xiaoping, China's strongman, that Deng Xiaoping gave the go-ahead and said, yes, there'll be no trouble placing this American researcher down in Guangdong province, that's the province we used to call Canton province, in southern China. That's where I had wanted to go because I had spent earlier a year in Hong Kong. I spoke the local dialect of Cantonese fairly well, and thus I didn't need an interpreter. I could speak directly with the villagers of the people whose village I lived in. It was a very unique situation, not only in the fact that I didn't need an interpreter, but also in the fact that the Chinese Ministry of Internal Affairs was overwhelmed that year by the large number of Americans coming in the country, and they did not have any official to spare to keep me company, shall we say, in the village. And so I was left alone for 1 year. I was allowed to build a house, was allowed to import a van to travel freely through the countryside, and allowed to talk freely with the people. Now, of course, I did have to quickly realize that if I were speaking with a large group of people, it was very difficult to get information, very difficult to find out the truth. In fact, the Chinese people have a saying. They say that when 4 people are talking together, they tell lies. When 3 people are talking together about politics, they tell jokes. And only when 2 people are talking together in a one-on-one situation, in private, does the truth come out. Fortunately, I was able to spend a lot of time talking with individuals in the village. I was declared, I think, to be an international spy by the Ministry of State Security because of 2 findings that I reported first in my book, Broken Earth, which I see the Society has been kind enough to provide to you. First of all, I found, after several months in the village, that the Chinese Communist Party had not benefited, their programs had not benefited the peasants, but had in many respects worsened their lives. Now this isn't news for you. You're members of the John Birch Society, which was founded in part because of the terrible tragedy that occurred in the late 1940s, when some 600 million people, with the, shall we say, tacit assistance of people in the United States State Department and government, were given over to the rule of a tyrannical communist party. The Communist Party came, of course, to power billing itself as being a party of agrarian reform. They were going to change peasant life for the better. I went into China in 1979 believing, more than not, that that claim was true. Now, I apologize for that, but you have to understand that I had been at Stanford University for a number of years, and all I had heard at Stanford University and all I had been required to read at Stanford University indicated to me that, yes, conditions in the countryside had, under the benign leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, improved dramatically. It's embarrassing for me to admit it now, but it took my friends in the village weeks and months to convince me that this wasn't true. Over and over again, I would have elderly villagers come to me and say, in private, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes they didn't even dare whisper it, sometimes they would just write it down on a piece of paper because they were afraid they would be overheard. They would say to me, you know, things were a little better in the late 1940s than they were now. Or, you know, in the 1920s, when I was growing up, we had fish and meat on the table 2 or 3 times a week, and now it's a rare month that we see it more than once. Or, in my day, this from a grandfather, in my day, the elderly in the village were able to wear silk clothes, which kept them warm in the winter and cool in the summer. But today, the government takes all of our silk, and we have to wear coarse cotton fabrics. Well, slowly I began to get rid of the misconceptions that I had brought with me into China, and towards the end of my stay, I actually conducted a survey in which I asked elderly and middle-aged villagers who were friends of mine, what time period did they look back on as being a time of when food was plentiful, when clothing was easily available and readily purchased, and their life in general had been a little better. And to my great surprise, everyone over 60 who could remember the 1920s and the early 1930s before the Great Depression, which struck in China as well, virtually everyone said the 1920s and the 1930s were a golden period. We had money not only by food and clothing, but we built a lot of new homes during that time. We built new ancestral halls and new temples. We were doing very well. Since the communes in the 1950s, things have been very bad. Very, very bad. So that was the first conclusion I reached that I think upset Peking very much. I gave the lie to their claim that their revolution benefited the peasants in China. The peasant population of China comprises about 85% of China's total population, now numbering some 800 million people. As soon as the Chinese Communist Party moved out of the countryside and captured the cities in the final days of the Civil War, they became a new urban middle class. They built new schools and new hospitals in the cities because that's where they were treated, and that's where their children went to school. They treated the urban workers well, too, fairly well, not as well as members of the communist elite, but they treated the urban workers fairly well because, after all, it's the urban workers, if they don't like you, who can rise up and throw you out. The peasants in the countryside, however, were scattered in 2 million villages across a vast land area. If you treated them poorly, you might get an uprising in this village or a disturbance in that village, but there's no way that the peasants scattered throughout this vast area could ever organize, could ever rise up and throw off their new masters. That's especially true because all of the means of communication in China are controlled by the party. The largest peasant uprising I know of comprised an area in Hunan a few years ago of 6 counties. Several million peasants, but only a very small part of China. The other conclusion I reached that led to the charge of spying concerned China's population control program. I was in China, in this village, in 1980, when the one-child policy first began. A directive came down in March of 1980, ordering local officials to keep the birth rate in that province under 1% that year. The directive said, if we allow all of the children now conceived to be born, the population increase rate will be far too high. So we must focus our efforts on women already pregnant. And that's precisely what they did. There were 40 women in my village who were found to be carrying illegal children. Bear in mind that these were children that they conceived several months ago, in some cases 6 or 7 months ago, during a time when it was legal to have second or third children under these circumstances. And yet now the state had all of a sudden, by fiat, declared those children, those unborn children, to be illegal. Meetings began. The meetings at the local level were fairly low-key, and some women, about half of the total number of 40, agreed to submit to an abortion. Most of those were women who were fairly early along in pregnancy, 2 or 3 or 4 months. But from my village, and there were 18 holdouts, and there were groups of holdouts in the other villages throughout Canton province. And the pressure intensified on those holdouts. These 18 were arrested. They were taken away from their homes, their families, taken to a market town many miles distant. There they were locked up in a commune dormitory. The doors and windows were shut. They were not allowed even out into the courtyard. The only light was a small 25-watt bulb. The interior was deliberately kept dim and gloomy because of the effect that would have on their morale. And they were subject to morning-to-night study sessions. After the morning meal of rice gruel, the officials would begin haranguing them, threatening them, telling them that they had no choice but to get an abortion. I was present at those meetings, and in my hearing at one point, one official pointed to a woman in the front row who was 9 months pregnant, very close to term, would probably go into labor in another week or 2, and said, "You there who are very, very pregnant, you shouldn't think you can simply sit in these meetings and eat the government's rice until you go into labor, because we will not allow you to keep your child. Should you go into labor before agreeing to an operation, we will simply take you to the clinic, we will perform the operation, and you will go home alone." Well, you can imagine the devastating effect that this threat of infanticide had, not only on that woman, but on all the women pregnant in that room. They were red-eyed, they were crying, in some cases they became hysterical, and they all, down to the last woman, finally submitted to the operation that was being demanded of them. When they submitted, when they agreed, they were then taken immediately to the medical clinic, so they didn't have time to change their minds. They were given an injection of an abortifacient drug directly into the womb, directly into the unborn child. This was a drug that the peasant women called a poison, and they called the shot a poison shot, because that's what it was. It was a poison injected into the unborn child that caused that child's death within 24 to 48 hours. It also normally caused the spontaneous expulsion of that child from the womb. But where that didn't happen, they simply went in and performed a cesarean section to remove unborn children who were, in many cases, 7, 8, 9 months along. We're talking about viable unborn children. So, those, I think, are the two conclusions I reached, one about the inhumane population control program and one about the myth, the falsehood that the Chinese Communist Party had liberated the peasantry. Those were the two conclusions I reached, I think, that angered and enraged Peking and led them to declare me an international spy. Now, it's not easy for an international spy to get back into China. Early this year, I published in the Reader's Digest an article about one of the women I had known in 1980, one of the women who at 7.5 months was subjected to this terrible ordeal that I've just told you about. I call her in the article Su Ling, and she was one of those who was taken against her will and aborted against her will. The article was quite well received, and this article came out in February, and in April I received a call from my editor at the Reader's Digest, and she said, "We've been besieged with telephone calls and letters. People like the article, and they're very concerned about Su Ling, and they want to know what's happened to her in the years since she was forced to undergo this terrible operation." She said, "Can you get back into China?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I'll try." I went in late May to Hong Kong, and I was turned down in quick succession for a visa by the China Travel Service, by the New China News Agency, which is the unofficial representative of the Peking regime in Hong Kong, and at the border, where I went directly one day to try and get in the country. It turned out that my name was on the computer, and every time my name was punched into the computer when I applied for a visa, bells would go off and lights would begin flashing, and they would know that they weren't supposed to let this person into the country. Well, I was almost about to leave Hong Kong in despair, to give up my effort to get into the country, when I heard a Chinese news broadcast announcing that the Special Economic Zone, a coastal city which has been open to foreign investment, the Special Economic Zone of Zhuhai was being opened to foreigners and overseas Chinese, and a visa wasn't required. So I said my thanks, and I immediately got on the hydrofoil and went over to Zhuhai, and I was able to get in Zhuhai and visit that Special Economic Zone. That was the first hurdle. There were government roadblocks, though, between the Special Economic Zone and the rest of China. I found an adventurous taxi driver, though, and we were able to get around that. And so one night, at 8 o'clock in the evening, just at dusk, I'd planned it that way because I didn't want to arrive in the village when it was still light. Just at dusk, I arrived back in the village that I'd lived in so many years before. And I had the taxi driver park outside the village. Taxis are very uncommon that deep in the countryside, and he would have been noticed. And I walked into the village myself, alone. I knocked on the door of Su Ling's house, and I was immediately greeted. They called me second brother because we had become such close friends. And I found, to my great pleasure, that Su Ling had a little 2-month-old boy in arms. And that evening she told me how that had come about. She said, "After you left in 1980, I was forced to have an IUD inserted." And here let me stop and say that the Chinese Communist Party's policy with regard to birth control is summarized in a Central Committee Directive of 1983. It's called Central Committee Directive number 7. And it says that all women who've had one child must have IUDs inserted, all women who've had 2 children must be sterilized, and all women who are pregnant with over-quota children must be subject to remedial measures. That's an order. It says you must have IUDs inserted, you must be sterilized, and you must be subject to a remedial, well, what's a remedial measure? That's an abortion. That's the only remedial measure you can take on a woman who's already pregnant to make sure she doesn't give birth. So Su Ling told me, after she had the operation, they required her to have an IUD inserted, and that IUD remained in place for 5 years. There were periodic checks, normally every 2 or 3 or 4 months. There were either pelvic exams or x-rays given to make sure that those IUDs were still in place. It is a crime in China to remove an IUD that has been inserted. Furthermore, they make the IUDs, for the most part, out of metal, so they can be detected by X-ray. In most parts of China, every 3 months, women step before X-ray machines, and there is a check made to make sure the IUD is still in place. So for 5 years, she wore that state-inserted IUD. But in the meantime, China had begun to get a little bit of adverse publicity because of its population control program. I may have had a little something to do with that. And specifically, people were saying, your program, your one-child program, aside from the tremendous human suffering it's caused among parents who want a second and third child, your program has caused female infanticide. I argued in one piece in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago that it was entitled, Why Chinese Peasants Are Killing Baby Girls. I argued that it was the one-child policy that was causing these peasant couples to put their baby girls to death. And to make sense of that, you have to understand, first of all, that it's very important in the countryside to have at least one son, because sons support you in old age. Daughters can't because they marry out. They go to live with their husband's family. So unless you have a son, you can't retire at 60 or 70. You have to keep working in the fields every day to earn your daily bread. And so people without sons in the village are pitied, and people without sons in the village have to get up at dawn every day like young men and women of 20 and 30 and work in the fields. And face gradual impoverishment in old age, but can never stop working, can never retire. So having sons is very important. Well, the one-child policy meant that half of all those one children would be girls, and thus half of all the couples in the countryside were condemned to gradual impoverishment in old age, a very hard and bitter old age indeed. And so it's not surprising that some peasant couples, not all of them, about 6% of baby girls were killed at birth by parents who knew that if their baby girl died at birth or immediately thereafter, they would then be allowed 2 or 3 years later to have another child. And their hope was, that second child might be a boy. Now, it's still a terrible, barbaric crime to put your own child to death, but you have to understand the situation these Chinese peasants faced. If receiving Social Security in the United States was made, if to receive Social Security in the United States, you had to kill one of your own children at birth, I'm not sure that we wouldn't have a problem with it here. In the early 1980s, there were some 200,000 or 300,000 baby girls being killed each year in China. The government knew that its one-child policy was responsible, and so in late 1984, it announced an exception to the one-child policy. It said in the countryside, for peasant couples who have real difficulties, that's the phrase they use, real difficulties, we're going to allow them, after waiting from 4 to 7 years, to have a second child. And so in 1985, when that policy was announced in Su Ling's village, she and her husband, who wanted a second child very much, their first child had been a girl, so they were among the couples who faced a very hard and bitter old age. They applied for a second child, and they were given permission to remove the IUD in late 1985 and given 12 months in which to conceive a child. Under that sort of pressure, of course, you can't always conceive a child, but they were able to after about 6 months. They conceived a child in the middle of last year, and that child was brought to term and was born in, it would have been about February of this year. But there was a price to pay for this second child. It was a little boy besides, and so they were very happy about that. Had it been a little girl, of course, they would have despaired because they had 2 children now, but they were both girls, and who was going to support them in old age? But it was a little boy. But there was a price to pay for that little boy. Su Ling had to agree beforehand to be sterilized. And so immediately after the child was born, she was taken away and given a tubal ligation, and she will never conceive any more children because she has been rendered sterile. Again, that's the population, that's the birth control policy. IUD insertion after 1 child, sterilization after 2 children, and an abortion for women who are pregnant outside the plan, who are pregnant with illegal second children for which they don't have exceptions, for which they haven't been given an exception, or third children. And now you know what the article that's coming out in January of 1988 is going to say, so you don't have to read it. So that was Su Ling's story. I want to talk a little bit today about whether or not communist China is going capitalist. You hear, of course, that phrase everywhere. Time magazine for 2 years in a row has selected Deng Xiaoping as its man of the year because, they say, of the market reforms that he has undertaken. Now, there have been changes in the countryside. There have been changes for the better in the last 10 years. But we must bear in mind that things in the late 1970s, 10 years ago, could not have gotten much worse. We now know that in 1977 and 1978, peasants in China were eating less grain than they had eaten in 1951 and 1952, 26, 27 years before. Now, peasants in China don't eat much besides grain. There are very few fresh vegetables, very little meat, very little fish. It's grain that comprises 95% of their diet, and they were eating less grain 30 years, nearly 30 years after the Communist Revolution than they were eating before. Now, that's an incredible statistic. Nations all over the world over the last 30 years have improved their standards of living, many dramatically. This year, the Republic of China on Taiwan is going to have an average per capita income of $5,000. Now, that's an amazing accomplishment over the course of what is, after all, only 20 or 30 years of time. Back in 1949, the per capita income of mainland China and Taiwan was about the same. What does that tell you about the ability of the free market and the ability of capitalism to produce progress? So things in the late 1970s in China could not have gotten much worse. Deng Xiaoping is not a closet capitalist. He undertook economic reforms because he didn't have any choice. In Sichuan in 1976, the interior province of Sichuan, where some 100 million people live, you could buy a little girl for 50 pounds of grain. You could buy a human being for 50 pounds of grain. That's how bad things were. When I took a trip into the interior in 1980, I found peasants living in remote mountain valleys surviving on little plots of maize, little plots of corn, and sweet potatoes. They weren't part of the cash economy. It could have been the year 1300 as far as they knew. There was nothing in their village, very little in their village that was made out of metal. Even their cooking pots were ceramic cooking pots. There was no evidence that those peasants in those villages belonged to the 20th century or even the 19th century. No evidence of progress at all. They were living in an almost medieval type situation. The government of the People's Republic of China admitted in 1980 and still admits today that some 200 million peasants in remote areas of China live at what they call a subsistence level. Now, what does that mean? That means that there are 200 million peasants in China who are totally outside of the cash economy, who grow only enough to feed themselves. They don't have either the excess food or the access to markets, because they're in remote areas, to sell any of their crop, and so they cannot participate in the cash economy. They're living literally from hand to mouth, and that's still the case today. Of course, the tragedy of China is that all of this poverty, which did exist in the late 1940s, would by now have been eradicated had the Nationalist Party been in power, had it been able to implement in mainland China the same policies that it has implemented in Taiwan. We wouldn't find toys and clothing and electronics goods stamped made in Taiwan today in our stores. We'd find Kmart full of goods from China. So the tremendous and continuing poverty of China, I think, can be attributed directly to the misrule of the Chinese Communist Party. about 3/4 of the homes were torn down and rebuilt. So that 75% of the homes in the village have been rebuilt since 1980. Well, many of those homes, the original homes, had been built in the 1910s and 1920s. There had been very little construction in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. New home construction is important because if you live in a village, if you have one good harvest, you eat better for a time. If you have 2 or 3 good harvests, you celebrate the New Year and the other festivals with a special fervor, and you can buy new clothes. But only if you have several good years in succession can you save enough money to build a new house. Like Americans, a new house is the biggest investment that a Chinese villager will ever make. Well, why has that come about? In 1981, the communes were abandoned. The commune was simply dissolved, and China went back to family farms. Under the commune, living standards had gone down. Under the tried and true method of family farming, which is the most efficient way to produce food known to man, production of food has gone up. Of course, that's not an accomplishment of the Chinese Communist Party. It's an accomplishment of the Chinese people who, given half a chance with their work ethic and with their initiative and with their willingness to go out in the fields early and work late, they have succeeded in bettering their lives a little bit. I came to know 3 brothers in the village extremely well. In 1980, they were all farmers, and they made about $100 a year. They were well off for rural China at that period of time. Of those 3 brothers today, only one is in farming. His income has doubled because he farms not only the land he was given from the commune, but he farms his brother's land. That's illegal. You're not supposed to sublease land, but they do it because they're a family and no one reports them. So his income is about $200 a year. Doesn't sound like much, but he's twice as well off as he was a few years ago. Of the other 2 brothers, one works on a small shipping vessel that he and 3 other people have purchased. They run it kind of as a small company. His income has gone up to $250 a year. The third brother is a truck driver, and he only gets paid about $200 a year, but there's a lot of business he does on the side. He carries passengers, unbeknownst to his state factory. He carries goods when he has a little extra room on the truck, and so he probably doubles his income with those illegal sideline activities. The Chinese people are hard people to keep down, but for 30 years the Chinese Communist Party succeeded in keeping them down. So what do we have? We have a Chinese Communist Party which wants economic reform because it wants to improve the economic situation of the country. There's no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party wants to rule a modern, industrialized, powerful China. But they do not want economic reform at the cost of political control. Deng Xiaoping has been very, very explicit about that. Now, liberals in the United States frequently argue, well, if the economic reform program succeeds, that's going to create a natural momentum for democratic reforms. Well, not if you listen to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, in 1982, laid it on the line. He said, there are 4 minimum requirements for China's political system. He said, we're going to engage in we're going to allow some free peasant markets. We're going to allow some people to own small businesses. But we're not going to engage in political reform. And there are 4 things that we must always abide by. Number 1, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Number 2, the socialist road. Number 3, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And number 4, Marxist-Leninism and the thought of Mao Zedong. Now, if you wanted to summarize communist ideology, this would be a pretty good summary of communist ideology. So, 20 years from now, China is going to be, still not going to be an industrialized country, but it will probably have a per capita income of $1,000 a year. Ordinary Chinese people will be better off. They will be eating better. They will be dressing better. But the Chinese Communist Party will still be very much in control, and it will be in charge of a state that is much more powerful than China is today. And I think we should all ask ourselves whether that's in the long-term interest of the United States of America. Thank you.